The world is definitely going through an interesting news cycle right now, and there's loads of stuff you may have missed because of the wider picture. In this episode, we're going to tech enhance your primary care and learning by covering all the various things you may have missed in the GP news cycle, including stuff around COVID, as well as finance. This is going to be an interesting episode, so let's tech enhance your primary care and learning. How are we doing there, Andy?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, Gandhi. How are you doing over there?
Yeah, ticking along, and it's definitely a crazy news cycle that we're hearing about as the wider world has its issues, shall we say. I know we're not going to talk about those things in particular on this live stream, but there is definitely stuff that many people may have missed over the past week or two because of the change in the news cycle. So we're going to go through those for everybody right now, aren't we?
Yeah, that sounds like a really good plan, Gandhi. And I think there's two main themes that we're going to be looking at. So one is living with COVID. We have some new guidelines out from the government, and we're just digesting those and understanding what they mean for primary care and ourselves in the health service. And then there's been some interesting articles just looking at GP finance, pay increases, pay changes, and reflecting on what those mean, particularly relative to inflation, which is running pretty high at the moment. So we're keen to get going with those.
All right. Well, living with COVID has definitely been one of the biggest things that's come out over the past week or so when it comes to the COVID changes. And this is as the world seems to open up and stuff. And we've got some fairly key information that many people will probably either be aware of or haven't looked at in great detail. We are going to be using the Living with COVID guidance document from the government itself, which is this lovely 63-odd page document, I think. It's definitely meaty, and there's lots of content in there. But if you don't have time to read a 63-page document, which I'm guessing most people don't, probably the key thing to have a look at is the changes at glance section, which is right here. Yeah. So important to know that some of the dates for this have already lapsed because of the fact this document came out at the beginning of the week. And yeah, we're already a week on. Do you want to summarize them for us, Andy?
Yeah, well, I might hand back to you because I know you did a really good video, which we'll probably link to and people can have a look at, that summarizes these in a bit more detail. This information is on page 22. That's there's a changes at a glance, which basically looks at the changes and it puts them in date order, which is probably the easiest way to understand what's happening and when it's happening, in my opinion. I'm going to hand back to you, Gandhi. Walk us through it. We can maybe react to kind of each date in turn, I guess, but go for it.
So the first one was the 21st of February, which basically said that in terms of the requirement for people to test when they're going to educational facilities, so schools, childcare, that kind of stuff, and that's both the staff and for students, basically. So there's the removal of regular asymptomatic testing, so the lateral flow devices many people are doing twice a week in educational settings is no longer required, and that was from the first kind of change that happened, and that was on Monday the 21st. Following that, there was a lot more change that happened on the 24th, which was 2 days ago from when we're doing this live stream. And the key one is the legal responsibility to isolate if you have a positive test. Now, the really interesting wording of this is it's the legal responsibility. However, they're still asking that if you have a positive test that you do isolate, but because they're taking away the fact that you will be prosecuted if you didn't do that, which I don't know if that's really happened, but it was written in the law. What are your thoughts on that, Andy?
Well, I'm wondering what this means for people in terms of their employment and the expectations of employers to go to work, because I think it was quite easy and clear cut when there was a legal requirement that people self-isolate with a positive test that they wouldn't go to work. Things have shifted to a moral requirement, I guess. They're still asking people to do it and still saying that that's best practice. But I'm just wondering what that means for employment, where people are fit enough to work, but there's no legal requirement that they don't go to work, but there is a moral requirement. Other people might be at risk. I don't know if you've got any deeper understanding of that, Gandhi.
I suspect it feeds into some of the later things that happen on the same date. So a bit lower down, you can see it says the end of isolation support payments, national funding for practical support and medicine delivery service will no longer be available. So basically, if you had COVID, there was this additional support payments that would happen. So, for example, if you self-certified, you'd actually be paid from day one. Normally, that payment wouldn't happen from day 3 onwards in terms of if you missed work and stuff. So that's gone back to the previous situations in terms of certification, off work, and that kind of stuff. And also the requirement that this had impact on other members of your family. So that's the second one, that they're no longer asking fully vaccinated close contacts and those under 18 to do daily testing if somebody else in the household tested positive. So basically, they're taking away a lot of those kind of requirements and stuff. Additionally, just to go through them, end of contact tracing. So there will be no more test and trace. how much impact that has, I don't really know, to be honest. And legal implication for people to tell their employers that they are required to self isolate. So again, removing that legal requirement for people to say that they have to self isolate and stuff. And all this is wrapped up in they're revoking basically the health protection aspects of the Coronavirus Act that came out a couple of years ago.
I think this, just looking at the end of legal requirement for individuals to tell their employer, I mean, I think we're creating a grey area here where people with COVID infection will be going to work going forward. I think there's sufficient grey area to expect that will be happening. I think there'll be some employers, some individuals where both are responsible enough to continue to self-isolate and be sort of sensible about it. But I think there's a grey area where we will be seeing people going to work with COVID. But maybe that's part of living with COVID going forwards, I guess. Gandhi, the next deadline is 24th of March. What's happening then?
So this is where the key stuff about payment comes into play. So we talked earlier about the removal of the support aspect. Formally from the 24th of March, though, they're going to remove the provisions for statutory sick pay and employment support allowance regulations. So apologies, I said it was the day 1 to day 3 stuff went on the 24th. Sorry, that's not correct. It's it's from March 24th that happens. The earlier stuff is the additional payments that are being paid. So from the 24th of March is when the financial support fully goes. And that's really important for people to be aware of, because obviously that may have implications in terms of the way that you self-certify and also why you self-certify and the financial implications for many people, which we're going to be talking about later on in terms of finance implications and stuff. But yeah, from the 24th of March, that's the next change. And that was originally the date that a lot of these changes were meant to come into play. They've obviously brought a lot of those forward because Boris said so. So yeah, interesting to see that change.
Yeah, and then from the 1st of April, so it looks like this is when COVID passports, essentially COVID status certification, passes. Current guidance will be removed, essentially. So is that indicating the end of COVID passes? I guess.
Yeah,
Where you choose to apply it as part of their own terms and conditions and right to admit or refuse admission to people, under their own decision process. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, pretty much. So from the 1st of April, and I do not understand why they did this for the 1st of April. I mean, April Fool's Day is the worst day to put mass changes to law, because you're just going to have so many memes, so many people misinterpreting the information. It's the worst day to do it. Seriously. But anyway, we're not in government. We don't make these decisions. But seriously, why would you do this for the 1st of April?
Okay.
Anyway.
And then we get some updated guidance setting out ongoing steps that people with COVID-19 should take to minimize their contact with other people. So is that what we're seeing in this box here, Gandhi?
Effectively. So from the 1st of April, no longer required to do COVID passes or anything like that. Updating guidance in terms of how you contact people. No longer having asymptomatic testing. And that's an interesting one, because we're going to come to the implications of that shortly. But also a lot of the stuff around the HR aspects of COVID are going to be changed. So formal guidance will come out in terms of what this means. Employers will no longer have to make specific mitigations regarding COVID for their employees. So for those who are clinically extremely vulnerable and stuff, a lot of the adaptations that many employers would have been had to make because of the legal implications of COVID and stuff will no longer be applicable. So there's going to be updated guidance in terms of what that means and stuff. And general health and safety and all that kind of updates and stuff will be coming in play from the 1st of April. None of that guidance is out yet. I suspect that'll probably come out on the 31st of March, which is why, again, I said the 1st of April is the worst day, in my view, the government could have picked to do this or for. But hey, they're the government. They make the decisions.
Yeah. So Gandhi, what do you think, what do you feel this means for general practice and how we're working in our surgeries going forwards? The public's receiving messages that COVID is, we're living with it. It's over. How do you think this will impact how we're working in practices, or how will things change?
Well, the interesting part about all this is that although all these changes obviously are impactful for the general public and stuff, the actual guidance that's come out for general practice and for the healthcare services itself has basically suggested there is absolutely no changes whatsoever. So in terms of when you have to wear masks, when you go to the healthcare service, whether it's general practice or hospitals or other kind of areas, still have to wear masks and stuff. Clinicians still have to wear masks and PPE when they're assessing patients. You still have to manage patients in red rooms and stuff, which, isolation rooms and that kind of stuff, which becomes more challenging if you don't have access to the testing. So that's going to be a really challenging part, I think, for many people. And there is obviously that implication and making sure we're protecting all of our patients. So clearly, how you assess those patients with temperatures, coughs, that kind of stuff is still going to be a real challenge for many practices, because obviously the public will now have this belief that COVID's no longer a factor, when actually for us legally it still is, because of the whole IPC regulations and stuff. So if people want support with that, there's a little video we've got on eGP Learning channel that you can send to patients just to emphasize the fact that actually all these things are still in play until the IPC guidance is updated. And that's a short 1-minute video that you can send to patients on us and stuff if you wish to help them understand all the changes and stuff.
It's going to be increasingly difficult to differentiate between upper respiratory tract
Yep.
infections and general viral infections and cases with COVID, because currently there's widespread testing. So it's quite easy for people to know when they have COVID.
Hmm.
We handle those people differently and we keep them out of the surgery as far as is practical and possible, keeping them safe and the other people who need to use the surgery safe. We lose that bit of information, don't we? So it's
Yep.
going to be very difficult because we deal with large numbers of patients with upper respiratory tract symptoms. It's going to be impractical to deal with all of those in red rooms and
Hmm.
take COVID precautions, but we won't be able to differentiate between them. So it's going to be difficult. Are we expecting some updated guidance for general practice? Is that coming on or before the 1st of April?
Fortunately, there is no date given as to when that updated guidance is going to come. It does state that the IPC guidance will be updated when it's appropriate to do so. Again, no date given.
Feels like now, but
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that is the update. The update did come out after Living with COVID document came out, so that the updated changes to the IPC came out on Wednesday, which said there is no changes effectively in terms of how you manage patients with potential COVID symptoms. The interesting part that came out was about the fact that testing, asymptomatic testing, is still to continue in general practice and primary care and health services as well. And if you have symptoms, then you still need to isolate for 5 days. And if you've got 2 negative tests on day 6, day 7, then you can go back to work if you've had a positive test and stuff. So, in terms of those rules, still apply to the healthcare services and then things. There is comments about vaccination programs and stuff, which we're going to come to shortly. But I think one of the key things about asymptomatic testing, which is really, really interesting for many people in the healthcare service to be aware of, at present, there is no clarity as to whether or not healthcare services will still have access to free testing from the 1st of April. It is for social care. That is written in the Living with COVID document, but not for healthcare services. And that's one part that many people are obviously keen to be aware of, because if we're still required to do testing but don't have access to free testing, that's a cost implication. And also, are people going to do it?
yeah, it's an interesting omission, isn't it? Because they've clearly
Mhm.
stated that free access to testing will be available for those purposes for social care, and they've not put the word health care in there.
Mhm.
That's a really interesting and probably deliberate omission. Maybe they haven't made decisions on that at the time of writing the document, but we do need to know
Which is
before the
boggling
1st of
for
April.
many. Health deal with the most vulnerable people. So why would you not apply the same rules as you would to social care, where they are also offering the care for the most vulnerable people and stuff? Again, they make weird decisions sometimes.
So Gandhi, are we scrolling down the document here, or are we segueing into the news at this point? I ask.
So, so it looks like we're still on the document there. As we can see, I mean, in terms of protecting the most vulnerable, there's more information in the document. If people do want to have a look at the Living COVID document, we will put links to that in itself. In terms of further protection, obviously, there is the question about further vaccinations. Did we want to talk about that, Andy?
Yeah, we've got a few. We're covering some of this in some of the news stories, aren't we?
Mm.
I guess the first news story that we'd picked out relating to this document was uh, expressions about the lack of updated infection control guidance
Yeah.
in this Pulse article. I think also in this or one of the other articles, they're highlighting concerns over the availability of free testing as
Hmm.
well for primary care going forwards from the 1st of April. So there's been a bit of reaction to the Living with COVID document in the industry press.
Hmm.
Yeah. And Gandhi, just more generally, how do you feel about the Living with COVID document, just in principle, just in terms of the kind of strategy that the country is moving to and adopting as we move into this next, phase after the Omicron wave.
I'm
Do you have
still
any
quite
general
unsettled
thoughts?
about it, to be honest. I don't feel that the plan has rhyme or reason, which is the part I'm struggling to comprehend with it. Changing some of the restrictions and particularly the testing aspect, just seems a little, yeah, unreasoned, shall we say. And the fact that we're seeing so little from those scientific voices in terms of talking about this, I think is part that many people feel really unsettled about. That this is just seems to be a political decision, not scientific based decision. And if it was scientifically based, then why are we not hearing from people like Chris Whitty, from Jonathan Van Tam? Those voices of the science. We're not hearing from them at all, and that's an interesting perspective for me personally, because they're the ones that we've been following in terms of all these changes and the science basically. And when it comes to this, it's always better to use the science and the evidence rather than just emotion, because we know when you use emotion when they come into public health decisions, actually you sometimes make the wrong ones.
It feels like it's becoming driven by financial and economic considerations
Hmm.
now. It feels like that's where the focus of decision making is moving on to. That's the flavor I get from the noises
Hmm.
I'm hearing, sort of away from a scientific medical response into a more kind of making decisions based on mitigating economic impacts and so forth. But you're right, it seems to have shifted away from hearing a lot from the medical voices on this, and
Hmm.
it would be nice to know what they feel, because it would be really reassuring if they were supportive and felt that these moves were necessary, because they built a lot of trust in the general public and medical community. But
Hmm.
well, we're moving forward, and we're living with COVID, I guess, whether we like it or not. It's
Hmm.
going to be here and circulating for a good while longer. So that was an interesting story in the news. And then I think this was just following on staff excluded. They put excluded in inverted commas here, because it's actually unclear, isn't it? Although they're not actively named as being eligible for the free testing moving on from the 1st of April. So
Hmm.
um, GP online picking up on that as well.
Hmm.
Um, so um, what's the future for COVID booster vaccinations?
So it seems that there is going to be a fourth round for particular individuals. So I think it's the clinically extremely vulnerable and the over 75s. There's plans for a fourth level of boosters to happen. I don't think health and social care workers are included in that. Correct me if I'm wrong on that particular one, Andy.
No, they're not mentioned within the article, which reflects on
Mhm.
information from the JCV. So JCVI. So that's interesting, and we'll have to see. There's certainly evidence that the impact of vaccinations wane over
Mhm.
time, and that's the rationale for putting in place these boosters. But healthcare workers not currently included in the plans, it would seem.
Mhm.
Although I think the general principle feels sensible. It seems to be driven by the right
Mhm.
organizations who look at the evidence and make decisions on this. So it's just interesting. And I guess we'll have to um, see how the government intends to contract and provide for the delivery of those vaccines as well.
Yep, and
I
that'll
don't
definitely be interesting
know that
following the
yet.
recent revelations about the vaccine programs themselves and the cost effectiveness of them. So, one of the recent articles that came out just in the past couple of days showed that actually general practice vaccinating the population is far more cost effective than using mass vaccination sites in terms of delivering it from a cost effective perspective. I think it was £10 per jab cheaper to vaccinate through general practice than it was to use mass vaccination sites and stuff across the country. Now, important to note that's taken to phase 1 and phase 2 vaccinations. That's not including phase 3 and the current rounds of vaccinations, because that data is not currently available yet. But it also raises the question whether or not general practice will continue to deliver the ongoing phase 5 vaccinations, I think it is, or phase 4. Lost track a little bit, which phases we're on now. But the ones we're talking about, the fourth round, it'll be. I think a lot of practices are considering whether or not that's something they're going to be continuing with, and whether the information that they are far more cost effective in terms of doing so will change that will be interesting to know.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I wonder, was there any indication, Gandhi, in what you read about where those savings were achieved? Was it premises? Was it the cost for mass vaccination sites to almost sort of create an infrastructure out of nowhere, whereas
Mhm.
general practice already has sort of management control kind of infrastructure there?
Mhm.
Is there any indication of that? There may not have been.
No, unfortunately, there's not a great deal of indication from the stuff I've seen. Obviously, there may be more high-level data out there that's not directly visible to us, but I would suspect a lot of it is down to, like you say, A, that general practice was obviously using its own infrastructure to deliver the vaccination schemes. But I think there's also an element of extra work gone into it. Many practices have gone far above and beyond working in terms of trying to deliver the vaccination schemes, contacting patients repeatedly, trying to encourage them to come down last minute requests and having access to the data allows that to happen as well. Whereas mass vaccination sites are very much waiting for people to come towards them, which has that a different impact in terms of how they work and stuff. But it's a sizable amount. £10 per vaccination is a huge cost differential when you incorporate the fact that most practices will only pay £12 per vaccination as it is. So almost, the whole sum of money is almost double the savings, to be honest. And I think it exemplifies a lot of what many people within general practice have felt that general practice is amazingly good value and often under-resourced when it comes to other areas of the healthcare system. And I think this is a really good example that actually imagine if general practice had had the suitable funding to do more, would we have done more? Kind of goes to suggest probably we would have done and saved the personal, the public budget a hell of a lot more.
Absolutely, if we have capacity, but of course it's a balancing act, isn't it? Because
It
there have
is.
been strong feelings about access to general practice over this period of time when general practice has
Mhm.
been taking an increased role across the country in vaccinations. So it's all a balancing act, isn't it? Really.
It is.
Complicated and nuanced as ever. Really
Mhm.
interested to know what people watching. I know we've got a few people watching on the feed
Mhm.
this morning, so really interested to know what people think about living with COVID. What that's going to mean for them, or what they generally think about that strategy for the country, and also as we're beginning to discuss the cost effectiveness of delivering a vaccine in various settings, and the prospect of a fourth booster dose for certain cohorts and individuals. Just very interested to hear what people think. If anyone's got any comments, and we'll give them a little bit of airtime.
Well, we have got a comment from Christina who says, "Morning, both. Good to see you. Thank you for today." So appreciate the emotion in terms of us trying to update everybody and stuff. So definitely, if people do have more comments and stuff, let us know, especially around the living COVID. But right now, we're going to segue onto something that's a little bit more financially driven, shall we say, and that's primary care finance. And this is down to a lot of things that we're going to be seeing, I think, over the next few weeks and months, particularly with the year ends coming into play. But in terms of primary care finance, one key thing the government suggests a 2% pay uplift for salaried GPs. This is from the DDRB, Doctor Dentist Review Board, that basically decide how much people should be uplifted. And they've come up with a figure of 2% for this financial year. What do you think of that, Andy?
Yeah, it's that time of year, isn't it, where people are
Mhm.
beginning to talk about pay increases and inflation and so forth. So, well, I know the rate of inflation, the CPI is currently running at 5.5%, isn't it? We've had
Mhm.
general supply shocks, demand shocks. People. There's a lot written and said about why inflation is where it is, but we're experiencing a period of increased inflation at the moment, and it was initially felt to be transitory. I'm doing my inverted commas fingers here for those on the podcast, and would go away, but it seems to be hanging around for longer than people think. So 2%
Mm,
pay increase next to 5.5% inflationary increase that may continue seems low, doesn't it?
it
Particularly
does.
given health services work very hard over the course of the COVID period to support the country and so forth, and often going over and above in terms of exposing themselves to risk and delivery of hours and type of work that people have done.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, on the other hand, I guess the flavour in the article and some of the comments from the Department of Health are that, and the Treasury are that a lot of money has been spent on the health service and on COVID.
Mhm.
Now, that's not gone into people's wages. People's hourly wages not increased as part
Yep.
of that. But they're saying a lot of money's been spent, and that there's now it's now a time for pay in for budgetary restraint as we come out of the COVID period. I think they're saying they've spent too much money and they can't
Mhm.
afford to spend more. So, yeah, it's difficult. I'd like to see more, Gandhi, really, because I think that we need to keep pace with inflation at least and cost of living increases. I think that's just a fairly simple kind of concept. What do you think?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think there was lots of muses made around the 3% pay increase that happened about 6 months ago, and what that meant for healthcare workers and that kind of stuff. So that was the nominated amount that the government decided to give in recompensation for the amount of efforts that people made with um, COVID and all that kind of stuff. And then when we raised the question back then, what does 3% actually mean? Well, actually, it didn't mean 3%. It meant a lot less when you took into account inflation. That inflation is considerably higher now, is even less of an impact and stuff in terms of the end pay packet. And don't forget, in addition to a lot of this, there's other charges that are going to be applicable to most people. So there's a health and social care levy that kicks off from the 1st of April, as well as pension changes as well. So if you want more details on finance, definitely check out our colleagues over at Medics Money, because they are awesome at explaining the finance of it. But very clearly, one thing I think most people need to be aware, most people working within the healthcare system are going to see a significant pay cut from the 1st of April. And that's irrespective of this pay increase. So
Rel-
I
Relative
don't.
to inflation, are you saying, Andy?
No, probably even excluding
Oh,
inflation,
okay.
to be
With the
honest.
other
The
changes,
health and
national
social care
insurance.
levy takes off 1.25%. The
Yeah,
pension changes increase, so you'll be paying more towards your pension. So in terms of your take-home pay at the end of
yeah.
the month, actually, even without inflation, a lot of people are going to see less coming home. Then when you factor in inflation, it's going to be even less. So this is going to feel even tighter to many people, I think, which is really uncomfortable, really difficult. It is going to mean that people are going to consider possibly changing jobs, leaving jobs. That unsettlement has impact on businesses and how they function. And when you factor that into our next article, it makes you really wonder what on earth is going on. So, you want to share that
Uh,
one with me, Andy?
Yeah, so this is from thanks to colleagues at GP Online. So real term GP income far below the level seen a decade ago and set for further dips. So it's bad news, isn't it, on the sort of personal
Yeah.
remuneration of those people working in primary care,
Mhm.
particularly the doctors. But as we've seen from the article before, I mean, and the thing to say just about the last article is where the recommendations on salaried GPs and hospital doctors go, often the general settlement for the whole NHS follows,
Mhm.
so we may be seeing similar recommendations for everyone else working in the NHS as well. But back to this story. Um,
Excluding GP partners. GP partners never include in those, so it's important to remember that because that's going to come up in this article.
yeah, although they have looked at GP partner sort of remuneration in this
Mhm.
article. So go and get Gandhi, talk us through here, and I'll scroll to the relevant graphs, which
Yeah,
are quite
so I think you're probably on the relevant paragraphs and stuff, but this basically looked at comparisons between pay from 10 years ago to current amounts from 2019 to 2020 was the last financial year they looked at. And there's basically the review, and it's in that particular paragraph just there that in terms of salaried GPs, there's a real terms drop in approximately 8.5% in terms of pay from 10 years ago to current years. Compare that to GP partners, which are down 15%. So almost double the amount GP partners have taken a pay cut in comparison to other healthcare services and stuff. There was a massive dip, and it's starting to slowly creep back up again. Emphasis on slow. That doesn't incorporate, obviously, the changes that have happened in the past couple of years. And as I mentioned, the additional expenses that GP partners are going to have to face in terms of social care levies, increasing pension costs for their staff and stuff. So actually, I suspect this is going to start dipping again. A lot of the justification is given in the 5-year contract that happened in 2019 in terms of uplifts and stuff. But important to remember that contract was negotiated at a time when inflation was relatively low. And obviously, the requirements were completely different in terms of what the outcomes were. And this all leads into whether or not they're going to renegotiate the contract, which the emphasis seems to be they are not going to renegotiate the GP contract. That's the wider stuff with the BMA and the GPC that's happening for this financial year, but looking at 2024 onwards, possibly. But we've not heard the outcomes of those negotiations yet, and we're only a month away to knowing what actually we're meant to be doing for next financial year. So
yeah.
it's all fun and games, isn't it, Andy?
It is. It's quite sobering, isn't it? Really,
Mhm.
and it's really interesting because I think people have experienced these pay pressures over the past few years. It's just very interesting to um, have been there and experienced. Actually, people haven't really been talking about them very much, and actually, still, people aren't really focusing on the actual take-home pay. People talk a lot about funding in
Mhm.
primary care, and that often gets conflated when people sort of hear a phrase like money for GPs and things like that. It
Mhm.
sounds like GPs are getting more money and more funding, but actually, general practice as a sector is receiving the funding with lots of strings attached and lots of things that it needs to be spent on and things that it can't be spent on. And generally, it's not getting through to GP wages. So I just think it's important that the general public kind of understands that aspect of how to interpret these sorts of stories and the information. I think what people have been talking much more about is working conditions
Mhm.
past few years, and that seems to have been where the debate has. We haven't even been talking about these pay issues
Mhm.
as much as we perhaps could have been, which I think just indicates how under pressure the sector has been, that people are too busy talking about how the working conditions are bad,
Yep.
and not even having the headspace to focus on the pay, which is going down in real terms.
Which I think puts more credence to a lot of those unfortunate negative and, bashing GP kind of articles that we see from certain areas of the media and stuff that say that GPs are overpaid and et cetera, et cetera. When actually, when you compare that in terms of real terms increase, we've seen a 15% drop in GP partner income over the past 10 years. That is sending messages in terms of the amount of efforts and work that have gone into play to support patients and practices and stuff. And like you say, actually, the workload conditions we know are even worse now than what they were 10 years ago. So, there's this whole concept of actually we're doing considerably more and complex work compared to 10 years ago, and we're being paid less for doing that, excluding inflation. So inflation hasn't even been factored into that.
The other factor as well, which I think is really important for everyone to recognize, is that this information doesn't take into account the number of sessions
Mhm.
earned. So this is sort of assuming a full time, a set number of comparing a set number of sessions per week 10 years ago to a set number of sessions per week now. And actually what we found is because the workload is so great, per session, that people are just working less sessions than
Yep.
they did. People are working fewer days a week just so that they can cope and survive. So that will further exacerbate this drop in income.
Mhm.
And it's clear that this isn't what the figures are. They're not, the figures aren't taking that into account. So I think it's just important that people recognize that as well.
Mhm. And then next up, Andy, what are we talking about?
So this was just something that caught my eye actually. So it was just if you remember back in 2016, the GP extended access scheme was put into place by the Department of Health and Minister of Health at that time,
Mhm.
and the idea was to allow patients to access general practice appointments, GPs, nurses, other professionals, the sorts of things that they would be able to access at their surgery during normal hours, to access them outside of normal hours, so up to 8 in the evening and on Saturdays and Sundays. And there was much talk at the time that this should improve patients' sort of satisfaction with access to healthcare, which was something people were talking about even then. Still talking about
Mhm.
the same things now, aren't we, about access to general practice? And it was also felt it might help with ED, emergency department admissions and so forth. And there's been a study that's come out from the University of Manchester, which has reached a number of conclusions. The headline grabbing one here is that they've found no notable impact on either continuity of care, interesting one to measure,
Mhm.
or overall patient satisfaction with general practice. It has not led to an increase in either of those measures, despite a large amount of money being put in place and an effort on the part of GPs and
Mhm.
other organisations in primary care to deliver this and put this in place. They do acknowledge that there is some evidence that it may have had an impact on emergency department admissions, which was one of
Mhm.
the stated goals. So that's a positive. And they also acknowledge that actually, whilst on the whole, there hasn't been an increase in patient satisfaction or continuity of care, some demographics and particular demographics have been particularly helped by this in a way that others haven't. So people who work, for example, or whose pattern of activity means that they have difficulty accessing in working hours care from general practice have benefited. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, and the headline is perhaps more negative than a comprehensive assessment of all the information might justify. But still very interesting. I think it just shows how
Mhm.
difficult it is to shift something like a measure like patient satisfaction. It's really, really hard to move that. And I think it's not only informed by people's kind of genuine access, but also
Mhm.
what they see and hear about it in general media and social media.
Yep.
Any reactions yourself, Gandhi?
To be honest, this doesn't surprise me at all, if I'm being absolutely honest. And particularly with the shift we've now seen to using remote care options, I think it would have negated a lot of the benefits that people may have seen from extended access, because actually it was originally designed to serve those people who would normally be working. Well, actually, remote access options does negate some of the emphasis on that. So therefore, actually, some of those populations would have been better served through that new and technology-driven route and stuff. Um, I think some places it can be really effective, and I think as ever, my impetus will always be is that actually when you put blanket commissioning decisions across the entire country, they will not work for the whole country. There's different areas where it'll be more effective and different areas will be less effective. And actually, more local based commissioning is always the better option, and the freedom to make those decisions. But as ever, people have different views. Really interested to know what people think in terms of whether or not they think the extended access scheme is of benefit or not. I know in that particular article, there's some comments from the IGPM, Institute of General Practice Managers, who state that obviously can be really a beneficial system for particular parts of the population and stuff, which I agree with. But overall, I do think that, yeah, it hasn't done what it was meant to do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gandhi, about the ability to make local commissioning decisions, because you can see how, some areas, maybe, city like Nottingham,
Mhm.
densely populated, lots of people moving around, engaging in different sorts of work, different patterns of work. Maybe that's the sort of population where this might have more of an impact on satisfaction and access. And, perhaps some, rural, quieter communities where maybe people didn't feel that they had a problem accessing their GP anyway. It's just a waste of time forcing them to put these schemes in place. So yeah,
Mhm.
I see Christina's engaged. She's asked a few further questions this
Mhm.
morning. What would lead to an improvement in patient satisfaction? Question mark, exclamation mark. The question mark, exclamation mark, I often think that makes the question rhetorical. Maybe it's more of a statement than a question.
Sorry, one. What would lead to an improvement in patient satisfaction? Oh, any ideas?
I I don't know. I think sometimes you've just got, I'm going to say, investment actually in getting more GPs, practice nurses, and other professionals through the training pipeline, give them somewhere to see patients, put them there, and let them do their job, delivering the tried and tested formula of general practice, and not
Mhm.
meddle too much. But that's probably very, very expensive compared to the sort of almost sticking plaster like measures that you often see from the government to try and get very short term changes in these levels. I think you've just got to hunker down, do what really, really should be sensible to genuinely improve access to good quality general practice, and then wait. But I think people are often a bit impatient. Gandhi, thoughts?
Yeah. Locally commission healthcare for the needs of the population rather than putting blanket bill options across the entire population, which don't always work.
Mm. And then Christina, I'm just processing Christina's comments here. GP pay, in my opinion, is that for most practices, if they are well managed, carry out the income generation work, claim the correct service payments, and manage their expenses. Okay, so I think saying just do
And
it
then
right, and
continues,
you will.
GPs as well and the whole practice team can be well paid whilst providing good patient services. Absolutely agree. I think general practice is a relatively well-paid profession when you compare it to obviously a variety of other things. I think when you compare it to the amount of work and requirements that we're being asked to do for the money that they're being asked to do it on and provide unlimited access, I think that's the part where I would say that there are differences of opinion of how effectively it is funded. And actually, the key thing I think many of us often do feel is that actually, if it was funded better and easier, then the outcomes would be far superior than what we currently have.
Good answer. Okay, and Christina says we will never be able to please all of the people or everyone all of the time, which I think is a
Hear,
truism
hear.
which is very applicable. Yeah,
Mhm.
good. So, shall we move on to the last story, which
Yep.
maybe is leaving us on a potentially slightly positive note? So,
Mhm.
Gavin says GP access is back to normal, using inverted commas fingers, on his tour of England. So, I really like the picture that they've used of Sajid Javid here. So he's there carrying a really big stick. There's a caricature of him here in the Pulse article carrying a really big stick and a slightly smaller or rather small looking carrot.
Measly, I'd say. Measly
Yeah,
looking carrot.
which is really nice and playful, which is good.
Mhm.
But yeah, so Sajid Javid has been touring England, but he's made some comments on general practice, indicating that. But now, since we're past the worst of that, services are getting back to normal, which is good.
Mhm.
And he's been saying he'd like to personally thank general practice as he's been pledging to go out and visit practices. So I think that's broadly positive, and it's interesting because Javid is a very important spokesperson in terms of understanding the government's narrative around general practice and health
Mhm.
matters. And so I think it's actually quite nice to see a movement away from GP bashing or indicating or suggesting that general practice is part of the problem to thanking them and saying things are getting back to normal. And hopefully that indicates that the government will take unnecessary heat off general practice going forwards. We may not see that, but it's nice to think that maybe this is indicating that that might happen.
Mm. My cynical head is saying this is setting us up for something else, to be honest. But hey, that's my cynical head. But we will see, as ever.
Oh well, but let's enjoy a bit of calm while it's there, and we'll see.
Yep.
So I mean that's the end of the articles that I think we'd had queued up today. It's been really nice just to do a more normal look through the news, I think, and get a sense of what's happening.
Definitely, and I think coming up in the next few weeks, you're going to see more content from us in terms of the variety of aspects of stuff that are happening. Obviously, updates and information from guidance in terms of documentation and things. We have got some a really interesting one coming up. So there was a document that came out about talking about the integration of health and social care, and what does that mean for the future for both the healthcare and social care services as well as the public. So we're going to be going through that massive document in an upcoming episode. As well as ever, we've got our regular content and stuff. If you do want to check out some of that content, do feel free to do so on the GP Learning channel, especially if you're a System 1 nut like myself. There's been a massive set of updates that come out in the past few weeks, which are really, amazing, for lack of a better term. Some of the stuff, and I know Andy still needs to go and watch this one because it's going to have an impact on him in his practice as well.
I love System 1. It's fantastic. I really do. So I need to have a look at that.
Cool. And as ever, we're here to help tech enhance your primary care and learning, and we will catch you in the